Hey everyone, this is Miss Moriarty, and I'm here to discuss with us topic 6.6, which is all about the advantages, disadvantages of nuclear power. Now, what is nuclear power and how do we generate electricity through nuclear power? We use this in a process known as nuclear fission. So, this is where atoms of uranium 235 are typically stored in a fuel rod in a nuclear power plant. What happens is we bombard the uranium 235 in order to then split that atom into much smaller parts after being struck by a then neutron. When the neutron is fired at the nucleus of that radioactive element, it then splits and releases lots and lots of energy, usually in the form of heat. And then that's where we tend to once again typically heat then water, create steam, turn a turbine, and so on. Now, the more neutrons that hit that atom, the more that nuclei is going to break apart, and the more energy will then be released, causing a then chain reaction. So, nuclear power has the ability to produce lots and lots of energy. Now, how does this work, right, at a nuclear power plant facility? Once again, right, we'll see that same kind of pattern in how electricity is generated. We'll see that the heat that is released as a result of the nuclear fission is going to create steam. That steam turns a turbine, turbine powers a generator, generator produces electricity. Now, in the nuclear power plant itself, we said that the uranium 235 is going to be stored in what's called fuel rods. These fuel rods are then actually submerged in water inside what's called the reaction core, and the heat from the fission turns the water to steam. Now, some other pieces that are important in maintaining this nuclear power plant and ensuring that it does not explode are things like the control rods. These are lowered into the reactor core to absorb any excess neutrons and slow down the reaction to try and prevent any type of meltdown or explosion. Water pump can actually bring cool water to be turned into the steam and cools the reactor down from overheating. And the cooling tower that you usually tend to see on the outside parts of nuclear power plants, that is what allows the steam from the turbine to recondense back into liquid, cool down, and then be reused for the process to start all over again. Now, some environmental consequences of using nuclear power. Nuclear power is technically a non renewable energy source, and the reason is the uranium 235 or any other radioactive element that we might use takes lots and lots of time to form. Now, even though it's a non renewable energy source, it's considered actually a much cleaner energy source than its counterparts, right? It's fossil fuels. But it does release another type of pollution known as thermal pollution, and it also has the potential to release hazardous solid wastes. Now, the reason why those fuel rods that are going to hold on to that uranium 235, once they have been spent, they can actually remain radioactive for millions of years afterwards. And so they typically need to be stored in a very secure facility in lead containers, usually on site at that nuclear power plant, which can take up a lot of space. When we go to mine for uranium 235, we know that as a result, mine tailings can be left over from that mining site. They can be radioactive, they have the potential to contaminate the water or soil nearby. Nuclear power plants use lots and lots of water to try and help cool the process down, as well as to generate the electricity. We know using lots of water can deplete the local surface or groundwater supply. Now, the thermal pollution that is produced as a result of nuclear energy. What thermal pollution is when we see a drastic change in water temperature, usually in the nearby surface waters, can cause thermal shock. So, this is where that concept back in Unit 2, when we talked about ecological tolerance, this is where that kind of comes back into play here, right? So, we can put organisms into thermal shock What happens when that occurs? We push those organisms into their intolerant zone because, as a result of those increasing temperatures, water's not going to be able to hold on to oxygen as well. So, we're going to see a decrease in oxygen supply and an increase in the suffocation of the organisms living in that environment. Now, obviously, another really big environmental cost of using nuclear power are the nuclear meltdowns that have occurred as a result. When we see nuclear meltdowns occur, typically in the surrounding areas, we tend to see higher frequency of genetic mutations, cancer in the people, animals, and plants around it due to the exposure to radiation. We can also see some abiotic factors being impacted, such as the soil can actually hold on to the radiation and further harm plants and animals in the future. We can also see the radiation be spread by wind over long distances and even affect farther ecosystems, even from the meltdown site. Now, some nuclear accidents that I would like us to know is one that happened back in 1979. And actually, it's a part of the reason why we've started to see a big shift away from nuclear power in the United States. This was an accident that took place on 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. They had about a 50% or so meltdown of their reactor core. Now, this wasn't necessarily a gigantic human casualty type meltdown. There was no real substantial environmental damage, but it certainly elevated the public's apprehension of nuclear energy at that time, and it led to the cancellation of lots of different new plans being implemented in the US. Now, a more famous and unfortunately even worse accident in history was Chernobyl in Ukraine. We saw here 2 explosions destroyed the nuclear reactor. Large amounts of radiation escaped into the atmosphere and the surrounding area. And there were lots of human casualties, and we still see this area being affected. Similarly, was in Fukushima, Japan. The reason for this disaster was actually a earthquake, along with a tsunami, disabled the power supply of the power plant in Fukushima, Japan, and as a result, a lot of the radiation was then carried via water around the surrounding areas. And I know that this area is still being impacted by high levels of radiation still today. Now, the last piece of nuclear power that I would like us to know is being able to calculate half life. So, we said before, uranium 235 takes millions of years to form, and after it has now spent, it can actually still remain radioactive for thousands or even millions of years afterwards. It only becomes safe when we start to see it then go under its half life. So, a radioactive half life is the amount of time it takes for 50% of that substance to then decay or break down. So, example, if we look at a isotope of cobalt 60, its half-life takes about 5.27 years. So, in that given amount of time, half of that cobalt 60 sample will then be gone. It will then have been decayed. Now, I'm not going to give us any practice questions on this just yet. Just know that after we wrap up our superhero villain debate, we will focus in on some half-life problems as well as a couple other calculating energy problems. All right, everyone, this is it for our video for today. Please make sure as you watch, you took notes, and please mark this assignment as done.